Today on Tales from a Witch's Hearthfire, I'm going to be discussing what it's like to belong to a coven, and I'm going to also be talking about some aspects of what it's like when you are in the application process of joining, or rather joining a student group for a coven. For those of you who are not familiar with the structure of covens, I'm going to quickly run through that for you because that would become important to understand the structure of covens later on. So usually within our traditions, that is the Horsa and Sacred Pentagraph traditions, and perhaps this also applies to other BTW or British traditional witchcraft covens. There are a total of 12 members, with the 13th member being the supreme being, deity, or whatever other people choose to call it. The coven is led by usually a high priest and a high priestess. In some cases, only a high priestess will lead a coven, but in generally it is led by both a high priest and a high priestess. Those will take up 2 of the spots within a coven, and then the other 10 members will be coveners of varying degrees or rankings. So let's talk about the process of joining a coven. That is usually a fairly long process. Seekers, that is people who are wanting to join a coven, and I just want to say that when I speak about covens, I am really talking about covens from my perspective, that is within the BTW tradition of covens, and I am not talking about casual groups or social groups or even open circles or people who charge for training. One thing I did want to mention very quickly about joining a coven is that in our traditions, and I'm not going to speak for other traditions, but in our traditions, we don't actually charge for training. So we don't charge for the classes that we provide and for any of the other services that we provide. And I say services because really what it is perhaps spiritual counseling or education or rituals and so on. So we are not a social group. A coven is never a social group. A coven is a group of individuals who want to see changes happen through magic and also who want to participate in rituals and spells. I'm going to go a little bit more into what a coven actually is in a few moments, but I just wanted to say that we don't charge for training, but there's a caveat to that. That is, if you come from a far distance for classes or for rituals and that is Sabbats and Esbats, you are responsible for covering those costs yourselves. So one thing that I wanted to quickly run through was what is a social club, because I think that there is often a lot of misconception around what is a coven, what is a social club, and what is an open circle, and so on. So I'm going to try to the best of my knowledge to just delineate those quickly. So a social club is a group of people who come together, who have a common purpose or a common goal or common interests, and their goal is to participate in that activity, but it is in a social circumstance. A coven, and specifically a BTW coven on the other hand, is really a religious body, and the coven will come together to practice religious rites together. Whereas if you belong to an open circle, that is slightly different because that may be related to a specific coven or a specific tradition, and in some cases it isn't. So an open circle is usually where a specific tradition will provide rituals that are open to the public. As you probably know, covens are not open to the public. Only coven members who have been initiated into the specific tradition are ever invited to attend any of the coven rituals. So you can see there is a little bit of a difference between a social group and a coven and now an open circle. So many people are under the impression that you can just join a coven. I'm sure that many other members of the High Priesthood can attest to the fact that when they receive seeker letters, people will say, I would like to join your coven. And I think what people don't understand is that you don't just join a coven. In order to belong to a coven, you need to be an initiated witch. And then there is an actual process that occurs in order for for you to become a witch within a tradition. So one of the things that people have misconceptions about is the process of applying to join a coven. And I'm using that language specifically because you don't just get to join a coven. In order to belong to a coven, there's a fairly lengthy process that occurs, and here again I'm speaking in terms of traditional initiatory witchcraft. There is a process involved where a seeker, that is somebody who is looking to eventually hopefully become a member of the coven, will approach members of the high priesthood either through social media or through email or whatever means. They will start to communicate with a person via email, usually via email or even social media messages, and try to get to know the person a little bit first. And then after quite a few of those interactions, we will ask for a meeting. Which, as I mentioned earlier, when you are a seeker and you are hoping to join a coven, one of the things that I would highly recommend is that you do some research on the particular tradition that you are hoping to join before you even ever approach a coven. That is so that you can get a better feel for what the tradition is about and the processes involved in that tradition. Each tradition has its own focus, and you might want to do a bit of research into that first before you even start to approach covens. So once you have been invited to join the outer court or teaching group of a coven, the length of training that's involved in that really depends on the student and also the coven itself. Generally, I think the rule of thumb is a year and a day, but that depends very much on the coven itself. So each coven will choose and decide how it's going to go about its training. Now, within our traditions, at some point in your learning process, this could be much earlier on, or it could be some time into your training before you are actually initiated. You may be invited to attend a dedication ceremony. And that dedication ceremony is not an initiation. What that is, it is a dedication to you continuing your learning within that tradition. And I think that that's sometimes where people get a little bit confused, so I want to specify that. So when you are invited to a dedication ceremony, it is a ceremony that marks a special day. It is the start of your journey towards eventually becoming a witch or becoming initiated into a coven. Let's talk about the different degrees within a coven. So generally speaking, there are 3 degrees. Again, it depends on the tradition, but I'm going to be talking about BTW and specifically in this case the Horsa tradition. There are 3 degrees. So when you are finally invited to an initiation ceremony, and before I talk about the degrees, let me just jump back 2 steps and say that one thing that many people don't understand is that when you are in that phase of training, you will have opportunities to meet the coven members. And the coven members also have a say as to whether or not you are going to be a good fit for the coven. And if it is determined that you will be a good fit and that your training is progressing well, and the high priesthood also feel that you have potential to be a contributing member of the coven, you might be invited to your first degree initiation. After your initiation ceremony, then that's when your learning will increase significantly. You will learn more about the actual coven rituals, because up until that point you have probably not been exposed to any of the coven rituals. So you will learn more about the religious aspects. You will learn a whole lot more about the rituals, that's the sabbats, the esbats and spells and so on, that are very specific to the tradition and the coven itself. As a second degree, when you are initiated into the second degree within our traditions, you have the opportunity to become a member of the high priesthood, that is the high priestess or high priest, and you can hive off. And what hiving off means is that you can leave your home coven and establish another coven elsewhere where other covens have not already been established usually, and you can start a new coven. In that case, when you have reached a second degree, you are able to lead rituals independently. You reach a third degree, usually in our Horsa tradition, that is basically considered an elder status. At that degree, you may still be running your own coven or covens, but you will be more focused on the overarching tradition. So your focus is no longer just on your own self and your own coven. Your focus is then expanded to be more tradition-wide. One of the students had said that before they joined the student group, they had thought that the process would be that they would, once they're invited to join the student group and maybe after initiation, that they would immediately slot themselves into an open position within the coven. And I just want to quickly talk about that because I don't think I've covered that part yet. That is, at what point are people invited, or at what point in a coven's existence is there room for other people, when I had originally said that usually there are 12 members of a coven. So this can occur for various reasons. First of all, if somebody who is a covener actually leaves the coven for whatever circumstances, and usually it would be something like they've moved away and it's too far to attend rituals. But most often the case is that when there are openings in a coven, that's because it's a newly established coven. Because as people in existing covens grow and continue on their process of growth, they will eventually reach the status of being able to hive off as a member of the high priesthood. And in that case, they will establish a new coven, and then they would be seeking new coveners to fill those spots. So in new covens, there may be potentially quite a few spots available. Sometimes, however, I have seen this happen where when somebody hives off, they will take with them a group of people who were students, if that is their choice. They would go with the newly hived members of the high priesthood, and they would start a new coven. But usually that would be a smallish group, and so those empty spots would need to be filled. Or if members of a coven want to hive off, then of course there's a few empty spots left in the original home coven. Now, another thing that many people expect when they join a coven is a sense of belonging. Now, that can be quite a tricky topic, and perhaps something that I will talk about in more detail in a later video. And I'll just touch on it very briefly here because it's very pertinent to what we're talking about, and that's belonging to a coven. So when you first belong to a coven or are initiated into your first degree, you may already have very basically started to form friendships with other people within the coven or within the teaching group. But those friendships are fairly new. And the longer you work together in an actual coven, once you're a member of the coven, the deeper those friendships tend to get. Later on, people have said that they would consider members of their coven to be like family to them. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that when you do belong to a coven, that idea that is stereotypified in social media of a perfect coven in perfect harmony all the time, in these beautiful, aesthetically pleasing environments, that is always going to be the case and everything's just always going to flow smoothly. That is not the case in a real coven, because remember, we're actually still human. So there may be times where you're not going to get along with your fellow coveners. Of course, there's always the hope that we will use open communication and that we will listen, that is, listen to each other, listen not to respond, but listen to actually understand. We always try to listen to the god and goddess, to our teachers, to the members of the high priesthood, and also to ourselves and to our own higher selves. So we try to do these things, but remember, we are not always going to get along. So yes, sometimes we will feel like family to each other, but that's because we spent an enormous amount of time performing rituals together, and sometimes even have socialized together and hung out together. So there is a friendship bond that eventually forms that becomes as strong as family. But that does not happen instantaneously. It takes a fair amount of time. So even though I have just finished saying we may not always get along in a coven situation, one of the things that we are all trained to do is the moment we enter the ritual circle, our egos disappear, because we come together in that moment in harmony to be able to work our magics. So ego at that point disappears out of the door. The other thing that I wanted to briefly say is that as members of the high priesthood, we are not your boss. We're not in control of you. The only thing that we are responsible for is teaching and training, facilitating the rituals, spiritual counseling, and things along those lines. But we are not there to take away your sovereignty. As an individual member of the coven, that is still in your hands. You still have to take responsibility for cause and effect. So another aspect that is very, very important to consider when you are thinking about joining a coven is thinking about it from the perspective of being able to eventually work in harmony with the group. That is, do you get along with those people? We will always look to see if you get along with us, or if we think that you'd be able to work in harmony with us. But that process is a two-way street. You would also need to see if we are the type of people that you would want to work with, or whichever coven you're applying to, are they the type of people that you would want to associate with? Are they people that you think that you could work in harmony with? Not everybody is going to be everybody's cup of tea, and that's perfectly okay. You can look elsewhere and find something that would be more fitting to you as your person and to your personality. When I had asked my coveners and students to talk to me about some of the things that they had either expected when they joined a coven or hadn't expected upon joining a coven, really there were three areas that tended to be the focus of their responses. So the first is that they expected that when they entered into the student teaching group, that they'd immediately be allowed to participate in rituals. And as I've explained earlier, that isn't actually the case. Another fairly prevalent set of responses from the coveners and students is that when they joined the teaching group and then later the coven, that they had anticipated that members of the high priesthood would be quite perfect, and also that the coveners would be really elevated. It's quite funny to me because we're still in our human incarnation, and as a result of this, we are not perfect. And I think that if anybody in a position of leadership or a facilitator tries to tell you that they are perfect, then that's the time that you might want to run away, because there is no way that we're going to be perfect. And so we are, like everybody else, are still learning. We're still in the process of development and growth, and hopefully we will continue to do that, continue to grow and to become better. When I had asked what were some of the unanticipated effects of joining the teaching group and the coven, quite a few people had said that what they hadn't anticipated was to see very soon after they had joined the teaching group some real world changes within their lives. And some had reported that they had completely changed their outlook on even society, and how they as individuals started to interact with society, and that they had said that it was a more holistic way that they were interacting with society, and that they were more hopeful. Some of the other things that they had said is that their mental and physical health had improved and that these were unexpected things for them. Now, what I wanted to go ahead and say in this is that I am incredibly pleased that this was an outcome for them. But joining a coven, or joining any group for that matter, I think, is never a substitute for professional medical or psychological help. Now, I have briefly talked about this aspect before, where I have said that you need to ask if you would like more training. And that's one of the responses that I received, was that it had come to their attention only later in their training that they weren't going to be provided with everything on a silver platter, and that if they needed extra help or training, that they were responsible for themselves and that they had to ask for training. The other part of it is that the training isn't always provided in the form of a formal lesson. Training can occur in many different ways. It can occur through observation. It can occur through hands-on work. It can occur through reading or through tasks and assignments that you are given. It can also occur through meditation or introspection and reflection. So some of your personal growth also occurs through other means other than just simply attending a class. And I think that that's something that a lot of people might not know. So one of the best pieces of advice I can give you, and this is from one of the elders, is that when you come into the teaching group and also as a member of the coven, come prepared. Come prepared for what you are going to be participating in. So if you are coming to a class, make sure that you have finished your assignments or homework and you are ready to hand those in. Make sure you are ready to ask questions. Be prepared to interact. Be prepared to listen. So the preparedness is very, very important. And when you're attending a Sabbath or a ritual, there are many factors and many steps that you need to take in any case to prepare yourself for that. I think I've covered basically everything that I can fit into this short time period for this YouTube video. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below and I'd happily answer them. Blessed be.